took a look at a related conditional statement. That was the converse. Before we take a look at any other related conditional statements, we need to talk about the negation of a particular statement, not of a conditional statement, but just a statement. So if you negate a statement or take the negation of a statement, it's just taking the opposite of a statement. So for example, a statement, again, not a conditional statement, but a statement could be a polygon has 3 sides. Then the negation of that statement would be the opposite. So there's a few different ways that you could word it, but the negation of the statement could be worded something like a polygon does not have 3 sides. That's the negation of this statement. You don't want to get too specific and say something like a polygon has 4 sides, because even though that would mean the polygon doesn't have 3 sides, if a polygon doesn't have 3 sides, it could have 4 sides, it could have 5 sides, it could have 6 sides. So this would be the negation of this statement. Okay. A second example is if our statement is you live in Lake Stevens, then the negation of that statement, again, I don't want to get too specific. So the negation of this statement is just you don't live in Lake Stevens. You don't want to get as specific as saying something like you live in Arlington or you live in Snohomish or something like that. The negation of this statement would be you don't live in Lake Stevens, and then it would cover something like you live in Arlington, you live in Snohomish, etc. And then in symbols, well, before we go over the symbols, let's go over the words. So if your statement is P, then in words, the negation of a statement would just be not P. And then if your statement is P in symbols, you use this little squiggly mark. This basically means not P. It's like the little squiggly mark above your equal sign for congruence, or if you're taking Spanish, it's actually called a tilde. It's above the N. Like if you say mañana, then you'd have a little tilde above the N. But that symbol in logic symbols means not. So this would be not P, and that's the negation of the statement. So using the negation to write another related conditional statement, you could write the inverse specifically using the negation of a statement. So the inverse of a conditional statement, remember a conditional statement is in if-then form. A conditional statement has a hypothesis, it has a conclusion. To write the inverse of a conditional statement, you negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if this is our example, I'm going back to the same example that we used a couple times before. If you live in Lake Stevens, just a quick refresher, this is the hypothesis. Then you live in Washington, this is the conclusion. So you want to negate both of those statements in order to write the inverse. Okay. Remember, the converse is also in if-then form. The inverse could be written in if-then form, and then you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. Once we cover in a couple of minutes what's called the contrapositive, that's in if-then form as well. So any conditional statement, okay, or any variation of the conditional statement, or they're also referred to as related conditional statements, also are in if-then form. But the inverse of this statement is if, basically not P, this is P, the hypothesis. So instead of saying not you live in Lake Stevens, you just have to word it correctly. So you can word it something like if you do not live in Lake Stevens, or if you don't live in Lake Stevens. And abbreviate some things. Then you also want to negate the conclusion. Okay, the negation of the conclusion, you live in Washington. The negation of that is you don't live in Washington. So then you don't live in Washington. And then we can determine the truth value of that as well. So if you don't live in Lake Stevens, you could think of specific examples that I used before. If you don't live in Lake Stevens, you could possibly live in Arlington. Okay, then you don't live in Washington. Say you live in Arlington, that meets its first requirement. Excuse me. Then you don't live in Washington. Is that true or false? Think about it for a second. Pause maybe. Okay. If you don't live in Lake Stevens, you don't live in Washington, that's actually false. I just came up with what's known as a counterexample. You live in Arlington, because if you don't live in Lake Stevens, you can live in Arlington, but that doesn't fit this requirement. You don't live in Washington. And I know there's an Arlington, Virginia, but maybe I could have used a different example, like Snohomish. I don't know if there's a Snohomish somewhere else in the United States, but if you don't live in Lake Stevens, like Snohomish, Washington, then that doesn't meet the requirement of the conclusion. You actually do live in Washington. So this would be false. I just gave a couple of counterexamples. You can think about other counterexamples as well. But then with the inverse, in words, if you start off with your original conditional statement, if P, then Q, then in words, the inverse of a conditional statement is not P, or if not P, then not Q. And then in symbols, not P. Remember, this symbol is not. Implies, not Q. Would be the symbol for the inverse.